Okay, so let's talk about what happened on Christmas Day, 2025. A series of really extraordinary social media posts from former President Trump set off a political firestorm. And in this explainer, we're going to break down the anatomy of that storm, what it tells us about the pressures that were building around him. It all kicked off on Christmas Day with this message. And, this is not exactly your typical holiday greeting. It sent immediate shockwaves through the political world, and it raised one single massive question.
Right. What on earth could lead to a post like that? To really get it, we have to rewind the clock by just 48 hours. And we're going to lean on a really detailed analysis by Heather Cox Richardson that pieces together all that mounting pressure.
So, the first major source of that pressure, it came from a flood of new revelations tied directly to the Jeffrey Epstein case. It was just one thing after another, a real rapid-fire situation. Right before the holiday, new documents get released. Then the White House takes control of the Justice Department's social media. And then, on Christmas Eve of all days, the DOJ announces this huge delay, saying they found 1 million more documents. And just like that, Trump's past connections to Epstein were front and center again. And this slide really puts it in black and white. On one side, you have the former president's absolute denial from his 2024 campaign. And on the other, the cold, hard evidence from the flight logs in these new documents, showing him on Epstein's jet at least 8 times. And it didn't stop there. Over 100. That's how many times Donald Trump's name appeared in just the first batch of documents that came out on December 23rd. I mean, that is a staggering number. And it basically guaranteed this story was going to dominate the news. So you can imagine dropping this news about a delay right on Christmas Eve. Well, it didn't go over quietly. The Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer immediately fired back, calling it a massive cover-up. And this is a great illustration of how the pressure was coming from all sides. It wasn't just about what was in the documents. You had senators asking the DOJ some really tough questions. You had the House drafting subpoenas. And there was even a move to hold the Attorney General in contempt of Congress. The legislative walls were absolutely closing in. But here's the thing, the pressure wasn't just coming from the Epstein files. At the exact same time, a second major front opened up, and this one came from a pretty unexpected ruling by the Supreme Court. The court essentially said, whoa, hold on. They found that the administration had not followed the correct legal steps before it federalized the National Guard for domestic law enforcement. This was a really significant check on presidential power. And at the heart of this whole thing is a law that goes all the way back to 1878. It's called the Posse Comitatus Act, and its entire purpose is to prevent a president from using the U.S. military as a police force against its own citizens. The court was basically saying the administration just didn't meet the incredibly high bar required to get around it. And tucked inside this ruling was a really fascinating shift from Justice Kavanaugh. His opinion back in September had allowed for these controversial immigration stops. Critics were calling them Kavanaugh stops, saying they amounted to racial profiling. But in this new ruling, he added a really important footnote, specifying that any stops have to be based on reasonable suspicion and not on race. A lot of people saw this as a direct response to the public outcry over that earlier decision. So let's just recap. You've got these two huge pressure cookers going at once. Bombshells from the Epstein files on one hand, and a legal smackdown from the Supreme Court on the other. Which brings us right back to Christmas Day and the former president's public reaction. And he wasn't done. Later that evening, he posted again. This time, he went right after the Justice Department's investigation. He called it a Democrat-inspired hoax, a witch hunt, and demanded they release the names of Democrats instead. Of course, commentators immediately jumped in to try and make sense of it all. Bill Kristol, a well-known conservative critic, saw it not as a sign of strength, but as Trump basically admitting that he was losing the public relations battle over the Epstein files. Then you had the group Media Touch, which looks at everything through a legal lens. They used a specific legal term for it, arguing that the frantic, defensive nature of the posts was a textbook example of what lawyers call consciousness of guilt. And this commentary wasn't just coming from Democrats or his usual opponents. Even a former Republican congressman, Adam Kinzinger, weighed in, and he pretty much characterized the tone of the whole thing as pure panic. So when you put it all together, the legal pressure, the congressional pressure, and these frantic public posts, what does it all actually mean? Well, for that wider view, we can turn back to the analysis from historian Heather Cox Richardson. Some scholars, like historian Timothy Snyder, looked at the sheer intensity of this reaction and speculated that it points to something even bigger. His take is that the facts we already have are bad enough, but the level of panic suggests there's something else, something potentially unimaginable that has yet to be revealed. And this really gets us to the core argument. Author Rebecca Solnit suggests that this is bigger than just one man's legal problems. She's positing that this slow, steady drip of damaging information is fundamentally chipping away at loyalty within his own party, that we're watching a political structure start to fall apart right in front of us. So the argument here is that these public outbursts aren't just random noise. They're the visible symptoms of a leader whose authority is collapsing, and whose own party members, many of whom voted to release these files in the first place, are now starting to break away. And all of this leaves us with one final powerful question. For a political movement that is built entirely around an image of absolute strength, what happens when its leader starts to look like he's publicly flailing? The events of Christmas 2025 might be remembered less for the specific facts that came out and more for the fundamental questions they raised about the very nature of political power itself.